It began with a young man selling dried fish and noodles out of a tiny shop in Korea. A few employees, one modest building. Nothing about it looked special. But could you imagine that this little grocery business would one day sell over 500 million devices a year, build the screen you're watching this on, and even the tallest building in the world? So how did a shop that started with dried fish end up controlling a fifth of an entire nation's economy? This is the real story of Samsung. The man who started it all was named Byung. He was born in 1910 in a small county in what was then Japanese-occupied Korea. This was not a free country. Korea was under harsh colonial control, and for a Korean trying to build a business, every door was guarded by someone else's rules. Lee studied economics for a while in Tokyo, absorbing modern business ideas most people back home had never seen. Then he left, came home, and went looking for something to build. His first attempts didn't work. He tried a rice mill. He tried other small ventures. Some of them failed completely. But Lee had one quality that would define everything that came after. He thought in decades, not months. Where others saw a quick profit, he saw an empire that hadn't been built yet. In 1938, he took a small amount of money and opened a trading company in the city of Daegu. He called it Samsung. In Korean, the word means 3 stars, a name meant to suggest something big, powerful, and everlasting. At the time, it was just a hopeful name over a tiny shop. Samsung traded in dried fish, local groceries, and noodles, shipping goods to China. A few employees, one modest building. Nothing about it looked like the beginning of a global giant. But almost as soon as it found its footing, history tried to erase it. Korea was liberated from colonial rule in 1945, and then came chaos. In 1950, the Korean War exploded. It was one of the most devastating wars of the century. Cities were flattened, the economy collapsed, millions of lives were destroyed. When enemy forces swept into Seoul, where Lee had expanded his business, he lost almost everything he had built. He was forced to flee south to the city of Busan with barely anything left. For most people, that would have been the end. War had wiped out their inventory, their buildings, their future. But Lee looked at the ruins of his country and saw something nobody else did. A nation reduced to rubble would need enormous quantities of basic goods to rebuild, and whoever could produce those goods would become essential. So instead of retreating, he expanded. In the years after the war, Lee pushed Samsung into manufacturing for the very first time. He opened one of Korea's first major sugar refineries. Then, in 1954, he built a woolen mill that became the largest in the country. Samsung was no longer just moving goods from place to place, it was making them. And in a nation desperate to rebuild itself, that made Lee one of the most important men in Korea. Through the following years, he kept expanding. Insurance, retail, securities, fertilizer. He was building what Koreans call a chaebol, a sprawling, family-controlled empire with its hands in dozens of industries at once. But the decision that would define Samsung's entire future hadn't happened yet. And when it came, almost everyone thought it was a mistake. In 1969, Lee announced that Samsung was entering the electronics business. On paper, it made no sense. Samsung knew nothing about building electronics. Japanese giants like Sony already dominated the market completely. With decades of technology Korea simply did not have, critics thought Lee was chasing a fantasy, and at first, it looked like they were right. Samsung Electronics started at the very bottom, making cheap black and white televisions, often assembled from designs that came from more advanced foreign companies. For years, Samsung was seen as a maker of low-quality, budget products, a copycat, a follower. Nobody in Tokyo or California lost a single night of sleep over a Korean company making cheap TVs. But Lee was playing a game measured in decades, and in 1974, he made a move that seemed almost reckless. Samsung entered the semiconductor business, the world of tiny memory chips, one of the most difficult, most expensive industries on the entire planet. It bled money for years. The technology was brutally hard. The competition was merciless. Success was far from guaranteed. Lee poured resources into it anyway, convinced that these tiny chips would one day sit at the heart of every important piece of technology in the world. He was right, but he would not live long enough to see just how right he was. Byung died in November 1987. He had taken a small grocery trading shop and turned it into one of the largest companies in Korea. Leadership passed to his third son, a quiet, reclusive man named Lee Kun-hee. And this is where the story takes its sharpest turn, because the son was about to do something that would either transform Samsung completely or tear the entire thing apart. For his first few years in charge, Lee Kun-hee watched his company with growing frustration. On the surface, everything looked fine. Samsung dominated Korea. It made huge quantities of products. But underneath, he saw rot. Samsung was obsessed with making things cheap and making them fast, and the quality was terrible. The moment that broke him, according to Samsung legend, came when he saw one of his own televisions sitting ignored in an American store collecting dust, while customers walked past it to buy Japanese brands instead. To him, it was humiliating. In June of 1993, he summoned around 200 of his top executives to a hotel in Frankfurt, Germany. What happened next became one of the most famous moments in business history. For 3 days, he unloaded on them. He told them Samsung was a second-rate company coasting on empty numbers, and that if it did not change completely, it would collapse into nothing. And then he delivered the line Koreans still quote today. Change everything, he told them, except your wife and children. It was a demand for total transformation, quality over quantity, excellence over speed, no compromises, no exceptions. And to prove he meant it, he did something almost unbelievable. In 1995, Samsung had produced a batch of phones riddled with defects. Instead of quietly discounting them, Lee ordered every single one gathered up. Around 150,000 phones, along with fax machines and other products worth roughly $50 million, piled into a massive heap at a factory in Gumi. Then he gathered over 2,000 employees to watch. Workers wore headbands reading quality first, and the entire pile was smashed with hammers and set on fire. Employees watched their own work burn. Some of them cried. The message was impossible to misunderstand. Samsung would never again accept being second best. And it worked. What followed was one of the most stunning transformations the business world has ever seen. That gamble on semiconductors, the one that had bled money for 2 decades, suddenly began to pay off spectacularly. Samsung became a global leader in memory chips, the essential components inside nearly every computer and phone on Earth. It pushed hard into mobile phones, and later into its Galaxy smartphones, which would go on to battle Apple's iPhone at the very top of the market. And in 2006, Samsung did something once unthinkable. It passed Sony, the very company it had once copied, to become the largest television manufacturer in the world. The follower had become the leader. Under Lee Kun-hee, Samsung's value grew from around $13 billion to over $200 billion. But this incredible rise carried a shadow, one that has followed the Lee family for decades. Because in South Korea, the story of Samsung is not only about brilliant products, it is also about power, politics, and corruption. Lee Kun-hee himself was convicted of bribery in 1996, involving payments to a former president. He was pardoned. Years later, he was convicted again in a separate case involving tax evasion. He was pardoned again. This became a pattern. The most powerful business family in Korea kept getting entangled in scandal and kept getting forgiven because the country's economy was seen as too dependent on Samsung to let its leaders sit behind bars. But the biggest explosion was still coming, and it involved the founder's grandson. Lee Jae-yong was the heir to the entire empire. In 2017, he was arrested and convicted in a corruption scandal that reached all the way to the top of the South Korean government. He was found guilty of offering bribes worth millions to the country's own president, Park Geun-hye, and a close confidant, in exchange for support of a merger that would tighten his grip on Samsung. The scandal was so enormous that it triggered months of protests. Millions of South Koreans flooded the streets holding candles, weekend after weekend. And those protests did something almost no one expected. They brought down the president herself. She was impeached, removed from office, and later imprisoned. The heir to Samsung, one of the richest men in the country, went to prison. But then the pattern repeated one more time. Lee Jae-yong was released on parole in 2021 and formally pardoned in 2022. The official reason was stunning. The country needed him, the government argued, to help overcome an economic crisis. Think about what that means. The leader of Samsung could be convicted of bribing a president, and the state would still decide it simply could not afford to keep him out of the boardroom. In 2024, a court acquitted him of separate financial crimes tied to that same merger. To his critics, it was proof that Korea's tycoons live by different rules than everyone else. To his supporters, it was a necessary step to keep the nation's most important company strong. And Samsung truly is that important.